This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 593 of the Late Round Podcast, on many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I've gotten some feedback over the last few weeks about this sleeper show, and that piece of feedback is that people don't seem to care about the players to sit section. I mean, it's been rough the last couple of weeks, that section has. I'll be the first to admit that. I've been like 50-50 with it each week. I was on a roll for the first couple of months of the season with those picks, but things have regressed. Maybe that has something to do with it. Maybe that has something to do with the feedback, but listeners aren't talking about that when sending the feedback in. The feedback is centered around the fact that they don't have those players to sit. So whoever I'm talking about, it's directed at a really small number of people. So I'm going to change things up over the final weeks of the season. Instead of having my typical 3 tiers of players, I'm going to add one that includes players rostered in 50 to 70% of Yahoo leagues. This is all on top of the sleepers that I'm already talking about. I'm not taking any sleeper picks away. I'm simply adding sleepers to this show that may just happen to be available in your league, especially if it's a shallower league. And I'll try to get 3 of them from that tier each week. And I think the approach makes sense. And I appreciate the feedback. My goal is to make this podcast as usable as possible. And I think this is a way to make this sleeper show more usable. Now, as for last week, it was a weird sleeper show. I mentioned throughout the episode that I didn't have a ton of confidence in the picks because it was just a really tough week. And I'd say the results were mixed. Some players didn't even play, like the Giants receivers that I called out, but Taylor Heinicke was super average. Boston Scott had an illness. He didn't even touch the ball. Foster Moreau was disappointing as a streamer. It was rough out there. The defensive streaming picks were fine, though. Taysom Hill was a good top streamer. Tevin Coleman's workload was solid. And Russell Gage came through with a big day. Given my expectations, I'd say the sleeper show last week sort of met those expectations. It wasn't very good, but I'm feeling better about week 14. Before getting into the sleepers this week, I want to remind you guys about FanDuel's NFL Sunday Million. The prize pool for this week is $1.5 million, with first place taking home $300,000. All you have to do is head over to FanDuel today, click on the NFL Sunday Million contest, draft your lineup of players, sit back, and enjoy some Sunday NFL football. Go to FanDuel.com to participate in the NFL Sunday Million. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Let's kick things off with this new tier, players rostered in 50 to 70% of Yahoo leagues. I know that these aren't deep sleepers, but it's at least giving everyone more players to choose from. And you never know, they might be available. They're clearly available in a lot of leagues in general. Anyway, let's kick things off with Jarvis Landry. He's still out there in about 30% of Yahoo leagues, and considering what's going on with Cleveland, he makes for a decent start. The Browns don't have a lot of pass catchers. OBJ is gone, David Njoku's on the COVID list, Harrison Bryant's banged up. That could leave a high target share for Landry. And that's generally what we've seen from Landry this year anyway. Since week 7 when he returned from injury, Landry's averaged a target share per game of 26.3%. Yes, the Browns are run heavy, but that still resulted in 7.7 targets per game. Against a Baltimore secondary that just lost Marlon Humphrey, I think Landry's fine this week. You have to like the potential volume that the Bills' passing attack might see against Tampa Bay this weekend. There's a solid 52.5 point over-under in that game according to FanDuel Sportsbook, and there's just a 3-point spread, so it's projected to be close. In neutral game scripts this year, the Buccaneers ranked first in the NFL in pass rate. The Bills ranked second. And Tampa Bay has faced the highest pass rate against them this season as well. So the pass catchers for Buffalo should benefit, whether that's Cole Beasley or Emmanuel Sanders, who haven't done a lot in recent weeks. They're still running starter routes and playing starter snaps. So in this matchup, you can get away with starting them. And then the last guy I just want to bring up in this tier is Sony Michel. I think a lot of people are making the assumption that Michel did what he did in week 13 because Darrell Henderson was banged up. But there were reports during the week that talked about Michel just naturally taking on a bigger role. And there was a tweet from Rams beat writer Jordan Rodriguez from The Athletic that said, quote, Sean McVay did not want to commit to Sony Michel moving into a traditional lead back role, but added that the type of downhill physicality the Rams utilize behind Michel and some of those blocking concepts is something he believes they'll need down the back stretch. I think there's a non-zero chance we see Sony Michel in the lead back role from here on out. He had 121 yards on the ground against Jacksonville after seeing 92% of the team's running back rushes. And that's something that the Rams might see and want to do more of. So don't sleep on him even if Darrell Henderson is healthier. That was sort of 15 transactions type commentary, but I think it was necessary to call out. This next tier consists of players rostered in 25 to 50% of leagues, so we're digging a little bit deeper here. The majority of you should be able to find these guys in your waiver wire. And I've got a lot of players in this tier to talk about, so let's kick things off with this week's top streamer, Taysom Hill. In week 13, we saw exactly why Taysom Hill is valuable in fantasy football. The man threw 4 interceptions and it didn't even matter because he ran the ball 11 times for over 100 yards. This week, he gets a Jets secondary that's allowing the 4th most adjusted fantasy points to quarterbacks. Hill should be rostered in far more leagues than he's rostered in. I talked about Marquez Valdes-Scantling on the 15 Transaction Show, and I think he works this week within this tier as well. Since coming back from his injury, he's led the Packers in air yards, and he's been among the league leaders in air yards. And over his last 2, he's seen target shares of 32% and 20.5%. This week, the Packers get the Bears. Chicago's been a slightly above average team when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. But they've allowed the 10th highest adjusted target share to wide receivers. And they're actually 5th in completion rate allowed on 15 plus air yard throws. What does MVS do? He gets those air yards. He gets down the field. He makes sense because of his big playability. With Adam Thielen out this week against Pittsburgh, you can look at the secondary pass catchers out of Minnesota. So that includes KJ Osborne and Tyler Conklin. Conklin's coming off a game in week 13 where he saw 22% target share. And we should expect some sort of bump with him with Adam Thielen sidelined. It's hard to find that kind of work at the tight end position no matter the matchup, so he works. And with KJ Osborne, like I talked about earlier this week, his projected target share is in the high teens. Pittsburgh's an above average opponent for wide receivers as well in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So again, I think both guys work this week because their projected increase in workload. The last time we saw the Tennessee Titans, Dontrell Hilliard scored more fantasy points than D'Onta Foreman. Foreman saw more work on the ground, but Hilliard doubled him up in targets through the air. The reason I think that split backfield was interesting is because it was in a negative game script against New England. And in that environment, it made sense for more Hilliard and less Foreman. Because that's how Tennessee has utilized those backs this year. Hilliard's been more of the pass catcher. You could argue that Foreman's usage in that game was a very, very good thing. Because in a more positive game script like they might see against Jacksonville this weekend, he could be in store for a decent sized workload. That's why I'm into him this week. Game script favors him more than the other backs in that backfield. Gerald Everett had a game to forget last week. If you watch that game, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But the peripherals were still fine for him. He still was running significantly more routes than teammate Will Dissly. He still had a 16% target share, and he still has a 20.6% target share per game since Russell Wilson returned from his injury. Now Everett gets the Texans, and Houston ranks as a top 5 team in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. Everett could have a nice bounce back week. Moving on, let's talk about players rostered in 10 to 25% of Yahoo leagues. The last time Ben Roethlisberger didn't throw a touchdown pass in a game, it was week 2 of the 2019 season. That was the game that he was injured against Seattle and then out for the year. Ben's also given us 2 top 10 performances over his last 3. And he's at least thrown for 200 yards in every contest since a tough week 1 game against Buffalo. I mean, Roethlisberger's not great. Don't get me wrong. But in a game against Minnesota, who ranks 6th in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks, I could see him being a decent enough streamer this week. With all the tight end issues going on in Cleveland, Austin Hooper makes a ton of sense as a streamer this week. On the year, Cleveland ranks 1st in the NFL in tight end target share. And they don't really have obvious options at wide receiver outside of Jarvis Landry. So if David Njoku ends up sitting, and with Harrison Bryant out, Austin Hooper could see a decent amount of work against Baltimore. And by the way, the Ravens are 5th in the league in adjusted target share allowed to tight ends. The Saints have been a team to attack via the slot this year. They rank 2nd in target share allowed to that area of the field and 3rd in total slot yards allowed. Elijah Moore against the Saints, he should be in your lineup. But don't sleep on Jamison Crowder this week either, especially with Corey Davis now out. Crowder has played about 71% of his snaps from the slot over the last few weeks, according to Pro Football Focus. And again, I would expect them to at least try to take advantage of that matchup against the Saints this weekend. We've seen the Houston backfield go from 4 viable options to just 1 over the last few weeks. David Johnson was out last week, and in his absence, Rex Burkhead handled 62% of the team's running back rushes, and he had a 7.7% target share. Those aren't incredible numbers, but they're not terrible either, especially after having a 55% running back rush share and an 11.5% target share the week prior with David Johnson. Now, I don't love the ceiling for Burkhead for a lot of reasons, but he should see some volume against Seattle. And Seattle's a team that ranks second in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs this year. It's tough to find running backs who are projected to see at least some volume rostered in a low number of leagues, but Burkhead does make some sense this week. Now on to the final tier, or players rostered in fewer than 10% of leagues you could consider starting. How about DeAndre Carter? He's run the second most routes at wide receiver for Washington in each of their last 2 games. And even though he only had a 3% target share last week, he had seen a target share per game average of 16% across his previous 4. Definitely keep tabs on reports around Curtis Samuel. But against Dallas, Washington may not be able to maintain their current run-heavy pace. During this win streak that they're on, they haven't had a single game with more pass attempts than rush attempts. But as 4-point underdogs this week, they may not have the luxury of playing in a neutral game script. So if that script flips, then Carter could see 5 or 6 targets. An obvious go-to in this tier this week is JaMycal Hasty. The 49ers are the 3rd most run-heavy team in football, and this week they get Cincinnati. The Bengals rank as the 6th best matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. Elijah Mitchell is dealing with a concussion, where his symptoms popped up a day after their game on Sunday. And Jeff Wilson is dealing with a knee injury, though he did get a limited practice in on Wednesday. But if both of those players are out, JaMycal Hasty would be the dude. And the last player in this tier to call out is James O'Shaughnessy. I talked about him last week. He didn't do a whole lot, but he did lead the Jags in targets. Jacksonville's a pretty big underdog this week against Tennessee, which means more throwing. And the last time these teams faced each other, Jacksonville tight ends had a 30% target share. It's definitely a dart throw, but of the lower tiered tight end options, O'Shaughnessy makes the most sense. As for the defensive streamers, there's a ton of them this week. I talked about Green Bay earlier in the week in the 15 transaction show because they're big favorites against Chicago. They work, but you could also go with Tennessee against Jacksonville, Carolina against Atlanta, or Seattle against Houston. All of those teams are facing offenses that rank as top offenses to target in adjusted fantasy points allowed for your defenses. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. We got one more show this week, the mailbag episode. Talk to you then.